Measure number one is a mess. It's an absolute mess. When I first heard about it, I was in a parking lot of some store, and somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, are you against corruption?" And I said, "Well, sure. Well, sign here." Well, wait a minute. I need to know a little more information. Obviously, everybody's against corruption. What do you mean? This is an anti-corruption bill for North Dakota. I said, well, first of all, I'm not sure we have a corruption problem. Can you tell me some problems? He, of course, couldn't. He was some paid out-of-state person just gathering signatures. But I asked to see a little more information on it. And when I read it, I said, most of this we have. And the people on the sponsoring committee are mostly very left-wing Democratic people and a couple of disgruntled Republicans. So I was a little leery of it. Anyway, the more I've gone into the details, the more leery I am of it. And today we have somebody that's spent some time in government and could talk a little bit about this measure and inform you about it, make sure you've got all the facts that you need when you head to the polls. Geoff Simon is Executive Director of the North Dakota Energy Association and joins us from the Bismarck studio today. Hello, Geoff. How are you?
Hey, I'm good, Scott. How are you doing today?
Good. It's nice to have you on the program. Geoff recently participated along with Jim Casper, State Representative, and two individuals on the Measure 1 committee. Dina Butcher and Susan Weefald did a little debate about this issue, and I was very intrigued about the amount of information that came from Geoff and Jim, and said, you know what, this is worthy of a future program, so looking forward to being able to chat about this. First, Geoff, tell us a little bit about you and what you've done and your perspective that you bring to this conversation.
Well, I've been a lot of places in my life and seen a lot of government in my life. I've covered it from different perspectives. When I came out of college, I was a radio news reporter. I spent time on a city commission and when I lived in South Dakota. I've been a state employee, so I've seen government from the inside. And most recent years, I've been a lobbyist. So I've been one of those people out there attempting to influence the process and look out for the interests of the members of my association.
So the big question that I have been asking about this, and obviously having the frame of all those different positions, you know what it will impact. What problem is it trying to solve? This is what I'm having a really hard time getting my arms around, to say, okay, if we pass Measure 1, what goes away? What bad goes away? What problem are you trying to fix? And I know that question's been asked of folks in Measure 1, and you get a lot of silence, basically. But what do you think they're trying to fix?
That is the $64,000 question, I guess. I mean, I've asked that same question. Where is the corruption? What is it you're trying to fix here? And I've characterized it as a solution in search of a problem. We've got a very good process in North Dakota. We've got just a litany of things in our Constitution and in state law that are those kinds of things that are anti-corruption. I mean, things like, provisions on bribery and conflict of interest and disclosure requirements for candidates and for ballot measures. There are all sorts of ethics rules that the legislature has imposed upon itself. And yet when you ask, what this ethics commission is going to do, what sort of corruption is it going to rout out, you kind of get blank looks. Well, there must be something out there, and that's why I say solution in search of a problem, Scott.
Well, I want to get to sort of ulterior motives and what might be behind this in more detail in a little bit. But it smells as though people are trying to use this to oust the Republicans, basically. That you use this as a tool, and all of a sudden we're going to have witch hunts like are happening in Washington D.C. and investigations and everything else with one goal, and that is to have less Republicans in governance. And I guess if I was a Democrat and I try again and again and again to win at the polls and I don't win, maybe I try this. And I see there's some interesting funders behind this, like big Hollywood liberals and people that really have no interest. So you just scratch your head and say, well, what are they trying to accomplish here? I mean, do you have a quick answer on the ulterior motive here?
When I look at it, I've also characterized this, they call it an anti-corruption measure. I've characterized it as really an anti-free speech measure. You've seen some of these assaults on people just because of their political views, and that's really the concern with this. I think my biggest concern with this measure are the disclosure requirements in here, because they don't just apply to lobbyists or corporations. They apply to individuals. There is no exemption provided in here. They will pull in trade associations, potentially a lot of charitable organizations where people donate. If you donate more than $200 to one of these charities, you're going to end up on a list if that charity ever deigns to step inside the halls of the Capitol and try to influence policy. It creates a huge administrative burden and frankly, some of these groups maybe are a little controversial, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice. You maybe don't want your name on that list. You don't want it disclosed. You don't want your neighbors to know. You have a right to privacy. And, really what it boils down to is intimidating people into silence so that they don't support these causes. I'm frankly a little surprised if, given the nature of the organizers here, that they didn't carve out exceptions maybe for some of the folks on the left. But it's going to sweep in everybody. There should be, in my estimation, bipartisan opposition to this measure.
When you talk about disclosures by individuals, what do you mean by that? Give me an example of how individuals would be impacted by this.
Well, there are no, as I say, there's no exemption, there's no exceptions provided in the language of the measure. It just says, the true source of funds must be disclosed, whatever medium you use. And, an example I used during the chamber forum a couple weeks back was, suppose a couple from, say, Hankinson jumps in their F-350, a farm couple, and they drive to Bismarck. Well, they're probably going to spend, maybe $100 round trip on gas. They go to the Capitol to testify on a bill, a weed bill, or you name it. They spend a couple nights in a motel, and they head back to Hankinson. You know what? They've spent $300. Now, are they caught up in this thing? I say they are. And the proponents will say, "Oh, that's nonsense. We'd never require that level of disclosure." But the other element of this is there's an anonymous whistleblower provision tied in with this ethics commission. So, if you happen to be at odds with your neighbor on this same legislation, well, they can turn you into the ethics commission, and then what happens? Is there an investigation? Are you suddenly on, the naughty list or something like that? You haven't disclosed your attempt to influence policy. See, this thing is just fraught with all sorts of potential calamities that would, impact individual citizens. And it frankly impinges upon their right to free speech.
And of course, the Constitution, it does give us some protections on that free speech that we take pretty seriously. They have an interesting position in here, speaking of the Constitution, in which, basically they say we're smarter than the Constitution of North Dakota. I mean, that's the other thing here. They say this thing would supersede our own North Dakota Constitution. Am I right, Geoff?
That is another danger in this thing because, I mean, if you look at articles of the Constitution, there are articles that spell out the individual rights in the Constitution. I mean, you can look through them, and this is, by the way, I've got about an inch-thick folder now of the pile of research that I've done on this. Article 1 of the North Dakota Constitution. Here's your Declaration of Rights, folks, and among those are the right to freely write, speak, and publish the opinions on all subjects being responsible for the abuse of that privilege. Well, here's a measure that says, if we find ourselves in conflict with any provision that's already in the state constitution, this one prevails. This ballot measure would supersede that individual right there. I mean, maybe the U.S. Constitution would jump in and step in on your behalf, but I mean, there's a danger in this. You can see all sorts of unintended or maybe deliberately intended consequences coming out of this if it passes. Yeah, and the problem with a constitutional measure, again, is you can't change it. The legislature, it's unbending. The only way you ever change it is to take it back to the ballot in some other form. Yeah, which is, of course, I think what they want. And by the way, it got a similar group in trouble in South Dakota with a big mess down there where they had to go back and start from scratch. So, it's being tried in other places, and you should be aware of that as well. Here's the thing I really want to make sure people understand, though. There are provisions. When you talk about ethics commission, there's an ethics committee that's appointed by the legislature, right? I mean, you can't bribe somebody. You can't, talk a little bit about the current protections that are already in the law to do much of what they say they want to do. Well, I mean, as a citizen, you can go on the legislature's website. You can download their legislative ethics rules. There's 7 pages of rules here. One of those, there's a state statute here that requires the legislature to appoint its own ethics committee. The legislature has ethics training for its members every organizational session when they get together in December before each session starts. There's any number of provisions in the statute already that cover this thing. So, again, Scott, what are they trying to fix here? We've got rules in place. People are expected to abide by them. The legislature has an enforcement policy. The Constitution, actually, if a legislator steps out of line and, somehow works a bill that's going to benefit them financially, that's a conflict of interest, they could actually expel that member under the rules of the Constitution. I mean, you can be kicked out of the legislature for violating its rules.
One of the sponsors of this is a woman by the name of Dina Butcher. Dina Butcher used to be a Republican candidate for ag commissioner at one point, and she has long been quite bitter at the Republican Party over the pro-life issues. And she said recently in an interview that there's too many Republicans, and it's just like, the Nazis. And which you can't even wrap your mind around, the ignorance and the horrific ramifications of a statement like that. But, again, to the ulterior motives here. In her case, she clearly doesn't like Republicans. She wants to do everything she can to take down Republicans. So comes up with a bill to say, hey, if they don't disclose 25 cents, then they're going to go to jail or whatever. What's behind this? I mean, there's big money funding it. Amount of state. There's some local people that have, obviously some ties to the left and some, disagreement with the Republican Party. What do you think is their ultimate goal here? What are they trying to do?
Well, looking at the motivations of the out-of-state groups that have supported this, I mean, it is intended to diminish the voice of business in the legislative process. That's really what it boils down to. And generally, you associate the pro-business side of the political spectrum with Republicans. So if you out those that are pro-business, or you intimidate people from participating in the process who are pro-business, well, you've probably diminished a little bit the influence of the Republican Party. I hesitate to question the motives of these people. I believe that most of them are well-intentioned. I'm not so sure about the out-of-state interests that have supported this. I mean, funded the lion's share of this. Only $4,000 has come from North Dakota, about $500,000 from out-of-state interests, many of which, as you mentioned, are Hollywood or Cambridge, Massachusetts, or New York City. Why are they concerned about corruption in North Dakota politics? You got to ask yourself that. There must be some ulterior motive here.
Yeah, there just has to be. And I also think, you've spent a lot of time on this, that the forum that the Greater North Dakota Chamber held as well, very informative, but most people don't consume that amount of information about, a ballot measure prior to going to the ballot. That's what I think is most dangerous here. This really sounds like mom and apple pie. Of course I'm against corruption.
Yeah.
Of course I want more ethics. I mean, why wouldn't I? So what I really encourage people is to you heard Geoff, you heard me, you could take our word for it, but read it and understand what we currently have and know that what they want to do here with a, easy yes, I'm against corruption, is modify the Constitution of North Dakota. This is very serious stuff. Anything you want to say, Geoff, before we let you go?
Well, keep in mind, when you read it, it's 1,400 words. And the fact that the chamber had difficulty getting someone to step up in opposition to this, I think, to me, epitomizes what's wrong with it. People do get intimidated and they're scared into silence by things that appear to make them look bad. I mean, how can you be against an anti-corruption measure? Well, when you look at the guts of the thing, it's horrible. It would, it would really mess up our good, transparent process that we have now. We have all sorts of reporting and disclosure and laws and ethics rules now. It's something we don't need, Scott.
Yeah, and by the way, it's not just politicians, right? Sitting in Bismarck, or legislators. It's people on, county commissions, to me, aren't politicians, right? I mean, they're public servants. They're taking their time to serve their county. City council members, same thing, mayors. And people that don't even get paid and aren't even elected, just appointed to some commission, could be wrapped up in all of this. So there's a lot of ramifications. Pay attention. Measure one, in my mind, NO, all the way. But make sure you get the facts on it. Geoff, thanks for the time. We appreciate it.
You bet, Scott.